Greetings, everybody. Hello and welcome to this CBRL webinar. My name is Dr. Carol Palmer, and I am the CBRL Director in Amman, Jordan, speaking to you from Amman, from my office in Amman today. And today, we are delving into the archaeology of the modern period and also conflict archaeology to discuss Dr. Nicholas Saunders' book, Desert Insurgency, Archaeology, T.E. Lawrence and the Arab Revolt, published last year by Oxford University Press. The event today is chaired by Dr. Robert Bewley, Bob, with the distinguished historian Dr. Bakr al-Majali as discussant. I will shortly be introducing Dr. Bewley, Bob as chair, who will also introduce our speaker and discussant. But before I do so, while we're also waiting for some people to join us, I'd like to say a little bit about CBRL and also give some housekeeping. For those of you who may not be familiar with CBRL, Council for British Research in the Levant, we're an independent research charity and membership organisation that exists to advance knowledge and understandings of the peoples and cultures of the Levant. We are also one of the British Academies, British International Research Institutes, or BIRI, through whom, by the British Academy, we receive a grant in aid to continue our activities and operations, but we are ever grateful to our members and friends whose donations enable us to do a lot more activities too and research projects. We have an office in London at the British Academy and 2 institutes in the region. I'm speaking from Amman today, and we also have an institute in East Jerusalem known as the Kenyan Institute. But we also operate across the Levant to support research in the social sciences and humanities and related disciplines. For more information, please visit our website, cbrl.ac.uk. So, to introduce Dr. Robert Bewley, he is chair of CBRL's Board of Trustees. He's also the co-founder and former director of the Endangered Archaeology in the Middle East and North Africa project from 2015 to 2020 at the University of Oxford. He's currently actually also with us in Amman today as director of the Aerial Archaeology in Jordan project. And so we're very pleased we're in different parts of the Institute today speaking to you. Bob received his PhD in archaeology from Cambridge University and was previously an undergraduate at Manchester studying ancient history and archaeology. He's the author of 6 books himself, and there's more details on the website and you will have received in the mailings today. So I'm going to hand over now to Bob to present our speaker and our discussant, and so we can move to the main event. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carol, and good evening to everybody where it's evening, good afternoon if it's in the UK, and I have spotted one person who is, I know, in America, so it's presumably good morning there. And thank you also to CBRL for putting this on. Behind the scenes, much work has happened to make it happen. So thank you to Maggie, and also thank you to Carol for all her efforts. I'm going to introduce Dr. Bakr first because he's the discussant, but also with an apology because he's not actually here yet. For those of you who know Amman traffic, you will understand the difficulties there can be. The other day, as part of, as Carol said, I'm here doing stuff. It took us double the time we expected to get from A to B, but that's another story. Dr. Bakr is a distinguished historian, used to be the director of the Martyrs Memorial and the Jordan Military Museum. He's currently an advisor to the Royal Hashemite Court. And a key player in the renovation of the Historical Museum in Ma'an, a very important location, as we will hear in a minute. And he is a scholar on many subjects, but particularly for tonight's webinar on the Great Arab Revolt. So with luck, we will hear more from him later. But the main event is Professor Nicholas Saunders, and Nick is the Emeritus Professor of Material Culture in the Department of Anthropology and Archaeology at Bristol University. I first got to know Nick, I presume through the Great Arab Revolt Project, but I remember it was to do with artifacts in the First World War. And in a way, that's why today's webinar is really significant. As Carol has mentioned, this is what in many places is referred to, some places would not even recognize the fact that this is 100 years old and not really archaeology. But of course it's archaeology, because we're understanding the past through the material cultural remains, the artifacts that people have left behind. And so I'm actually very excited to hear more about this. The book is fantastic. Chatting to Nick earlier, this is about access to information. And the main source of this information is a book. So if you are inspired by tonight's talk, please buy a copy of the book. It focuses on the Hejaz Railway. And without further ado, I will hand over to Nick to take us on this journey of the Great Arab Revolt and the Desert Insurgency. So Nick will now share his screen. So there may be, you never know, a technical hitch, but let's hope not. The floor is yours, Nick.
Okay. All right. Okay. So what I'd like to do today is to give an overview of the 10-year project that we carried on as the Great Arab Revolt Project in southern Jordan, for the main part from Ma'an south to Mudawwara, in fact a bit further than Mudawwara, almost to the Saudi border. But at the same time, I want to sort of pick up a couple of things that Bob just said in terms of what is archaeology and what kind of archaeology are we looking at this material from 100 years ago or so. So I want to try and kill several birds with one stone, but to mainly, I think, give you an overview and an introduction into the kind of archaeology that we call modern conflict archaeology, which is essentially interdisciplinary and informed by theory, material culture, landscape, and various other aspects. So let me make a start and make sure everything is working. Yep, that's fine. So we spent 10 years basically in the desert of southern Jordan. We thought initially that we would be looking at some of the ruined Hejaz railway stations, and that it would take several years perhaps. Within 1 hour of being on site, we discovered things which completely changed our view of what we were doing and what we thought we would be doing. And it went from 2 to 3 years to basically 10 years. We're looking at archaeology, anthropology, cultural and military history, museology, heritage, tourism. And we're dealing with issues of landscape, material culture, remote sensing and imagery, and most important, or one of the most important, is archival research, particularly with photographs. So what we realized very, very soon was that we were looking at the footprint of the archaeology of the origins of modern guerrilla warfare. And as with so many times that we found during the 10 years we were working there, there were aspects of what T.E. Lawrence had written in 7 Pillars of Wisdom. I don't want to get into was he a fantasist, was he an Arabist? I will make some comments as we go through, But I think one of the really important things which we did see when we were doing field work was the archaeological remains of what Lawrence wrote, and which is written here. Suppose we were, as we might be, an influence, an idea, a thing intangible, invulnerable, without front or back, drifting about like a gas. Armies were like plants, immobile as a whole, firm-rooted. We might be a vapor, blowing where we listed. This is the essence of the effectiveness of guerrilla warfare, asymmetrical warfare. And as far as I think we in the project were concerned, the Arab Revolt was the first real sustained example of modern guerrilla warfare. Guerrilla warfare had always existed, but this was modern. And as we went through the years of fieldwork, we found ever more examples of this, and realized that whatever else we thought we were doing, we were also charting a course for the archaeological investigation of modern guerrilla warfare. This is a map, several maps of our area. On the left, you can see the Hejaz Railway from Damascus in the north to Medina in the south. Of course, it was originally supposed to go to Mecca, further south near the coast, but for a variety of reasons, this never happened, and so the railway stopped in Medina. Our project on the right-hand side map shows basically Man to Mudawwara and a bit further south to the actual border with Saudi Arabia. That was our area, about 60 odd miles or so. So we spent roughly 10 years investigating the archaeology, probably of about 18 months of the Arab Revolt. The Hejaz Railway was the spine along which we worked. Our work took us away from the railway itself into an extended conflict landscape that we had no idea was there, and I think most people had no real idea of that it was there, apart from, of course, the Bedouin, whose tribal and traditional lands it has always been. But even they, of course, had their own interests, so they didn't necessarily look for the things that we were looking for. So here we have the railway being built by Hejaz Railway Line battalions, Ottoman railway battalions, mainly made of Syrian workers, soldiers. Below, we can see what mainly the area today in terms of the embankment. The railway lines have long been taken up and disappeared. A part of the Hejaz Railway has been rebuilt, reconstituted to take more recent and heavier and more modern phosphate trains, and that's what you can see on the right hand side, which is still in use on a daily basis and goes from this area down to Aqaba, and I'll come back to that. One of the things which we were not prepared for, because we could not find a lot of information about, but also we couldn't find any archaeological information about, was the actual lives of the railway workers themselves who built the Hejaz Railway between 1900 and 1908. And we started to encounter what we initially thought were Ottoman army campsites, parallel rows of tent rings, as you can see several examples here next to the railway. We soon realized, of course, that this was not army encampments at all. but the beginnings of the movement across the landscape from Ma'an to Mudawwara of the railway construction teams themselves, who built their campsites in parallel rows, 9 or 10 or 11 or 12 in a row, and then another 12 on the other side. And we encountered more than 100 of these, and we were completely surprised to find these. It did, in fact, sensitize us to a whole range of things which were going on and which we didn't realize at the time. But they are very distinctive, as you can see from this Google Earth imagery, and it goes obviously down well into modern day Saudi Arabia, down towards Medina. And this is a close-up version of the previous shot at a place called Tel Sham. And you can see the parallel rows there, but you can also see there's a couple of outliers in various places which we think, and archaeology has tended to reinforce, that what we're really looking at there is a sort of an NCO, or maybe an officer, who was in charge of the team who lived in that row of tents originally. Bell tents they would have been, though obviously today it's just a ring of stones. But they were very sort of insightful as to the arrival of modernity in the desert in the Middle East, which had not been seen before. And so we, over the years, we became quite adept at surveying and selectively excavating various of these tent ring circles. And this is this is what one of these looks like in close-up. It's one which we call Bird's Nest Construction Camp. And I think this was, we excavated this in 2012. We excavated several of these in 2012. But our calculation was that this was probably built as a construction camp around about 1905. And this one is particularly well preserved because the construction technique reflects the local geology, and the geology changes in our area from Ma'an in the north to Mudawwara in the south. And as it passes, as the railway passes through different geology, the adjacent labor camps are built of different material, and so preserve more, better, or less well, depending on the local geology. And this is what one of these labor camps would have looked like. You can't really see the lines, the parallel lines so well in this photograph, but it does give you a sort of a human aspect, dimension, with Ottoman surveyors and engineers standing in front of the laborers' tents. So between 1908, between 1900 and 1908, hundreds of these camps were built. And of course, once the railway and the bridges had been built in a particular area, the camp was moved further south. So these tents and the people would just be recycled through the landscape. And so there's this extraordinary archaeological record beginning in 1900, finishing roughly in 1908, of the movement of huge tented encampments across the landscape, all the way down, in fact, from Damascus to Medina. And it was dense enough in our area of Man to Mudawwara. What had drawn us initially to this part of Jordan was thinking that it would be good to do a modern archaeological survey and a little bit of excavation of the Hejaz Railway stations. That soon changed, as I mentioned earlier, and we'll come back to. But mainly, these stations had three phases: construction, as you can see in the top image, reconstruction, as you can see bottom left, and abandonment, basically, and ruination, as you can see bottom right. One of the really interesting things which we learned as we went through this area was that, again, unknown to us in any detail at the beginning, but known in great archaeological detail by the end of the project, was the apparent survival in some areas of the original Hejaz Railway Station buildings, which were not the original Hejaz Railway Station buildings at all. They were recycled, hybrid, with original materials for the main part, but as basically part of a refurbishment in the mid to late 1960s, where vast areas of track and buildings had been cleaned up, rebuilt, repaired, presumably according to some kind of original plans of the buildings. And this is what we were encountering when we initially thought that we were encountering the ruins of basically First World War, Arab Revolt period attacks and destruction. That was not the case at all. However attractive and seductive that idea initially was. But I'll come back to that as well. And it does highlight the idea, the issue of what is it one is looking at in terms of modern archaeology, or the archaeology of recent historical times, or the archaeology of recent conflicts. Can we be sure about what we're actually seeing, and how do we actually interpret it? And this is an example of that. It's the ruined station of Ghadir al-Hajj, just south of Ma'an. And it was attacked several times, but it was basically destroyed by Faisal's army, Hawitat Bedouin and French artillery in April 1918. And this was a photograph taken then. So this is a photograph from the Arab Revolt itself, and the station has just been destroyed. This is our excavation survey of Ghadir al-Hajj in 2011. And if you look at that, and then look at that, the temptation is to say, or to think, that that's basically what one would have left after 1918 destruction there. But in fact, that's totally misleading, because this station and the track was rebuilt during the 1960s. So what we're actually seeing here is the destruction that has taken place at Ghadir al-Hajj between, let's say, 1968, 69, 70, and when we arrived there in 2011. So we are looking at a palimpsest of a site, partly destroyed, almost totally destroyed during the Arab Revolt, then rebuilt, then pillaged and blown up, and materials taken away for building materials for other places. And then to arrive and see that and compare it with that, the temptation is obvious, but it's not true. And to give you an example from another site, this is the site called the Block House, which is a bit further south again, right next to the Hejaz Railway line, the one that's still being used. You can see in the background just a bit over here. But if you look carefully at this building, it's clear that it has been rebuilt and patched up and reconstructed heavily. At least 2/3 of this building was reconstructed during the 1960s refurbishment. And certainly everything above the two slots here for rifles, the two loopholes beneath the main window, everything above that and a lot probably below it has been completely reconstructed. So this is not a survival from the Arab Revolt. It's a recycled monument with some new stones, but also with some of the original ones, which were picked up on the site and reconstructed here. So again, it's a case of understanding what one is seeing and not what one wants to see and investigate. And this is certainly very obvious in the archaeology of the contemporary era, far more obvious and a lot easier than looking into prehistory or classical antiquity. The anthropology and archaeology, which I think mainly for the project, and certainly from my own experience, anthropology is an aspect of archaeology and vice versa, depending on one's interest is in archaeology or anthropology. But from our point of view, it's one of the same, because an anthropology of the modern era can create an archaeological footprint, an archaeological record, which 10 years, 50 years, 200 years later can be misunderstood purely from an archaeological point of view. So what we have here is the Halat Amar ambush, famous on the 19th of September 1917. Top left is the actual site, which lies in no man's land south of Mudawwara and approaching the border with Saudi Arabia, and for which we needed special permission and Jordanian army minders, we could put it that way. So what you're looking at here is the actual site of the ambush that took place in September 1917, and which forever is famous from the picture below, taken from the film, David Lean's film, Lawrence of Arabia, 1962, even though that particular site was in southern Spain and not in North Africa, not in the Middle East, and certainly not in Jordan. So we have a famous event which has become mythologized and has a visual legacy in Hollywood film. Nobody, it seemed, had ever thought about, maybe we should go and have a look at the real site, and what does the archaeology and indeed the anthropology tell us of that site, which we were very honored and to be able to do this. There is another aspect of this, of course, which is on the photograph on the right hand side, which is the mixture of history, archaeology, Hollywood and tourism heritage. And so what we have there is a staged attack on a railway carriage right outside of Wadi Rum, with the railway track itself, of course, was never there during the Arab Revolt. So this is completely fake in that sense, but on the other hand gives the average tourist a sense of what it might have been like to be riding one of these Hejaz Railway trains and to be attacked by the Bedouin. So here we have a single slide of 3 images, which one could talk about, or at least people from the project could talk about for probably an hour or more. I'll resist that temptation, but it does go to show how a modern take, a modern visual cinematic take on a historical event, produces several kinds of consequences, one of which is archaeological, of the real place. The other is the image that people carry in their mind from the film. And then there's this strange hybrid creation that some people have the opportunity to indulge if they go to southern Jordan and pay their money and go on one of these staged events by Wadi Rum. And this is part of our archaeology. The Halat Ammar ambush site itself, it was really, it took a long time to try and make sense of this, but it was the archaeology of a 10-minute ambush, as Lawrence himself said. We don't have time to go into the whole sequence of events, but it was, as far as we know, the first time that anybody had ever done an archaeological survey, excavation, and then interpretation in the light of what Lawrence had written, but also other people subsequently, in terms of what was still there, what bullet and mortar shell cases were still there, what did the landscape look like, and these squares here are the this is the railway, this is the train carriages as they came off the track, and here was the bridge which was blown, and the whole event is extremely famous and very well published. But actually looking on the ground in terms of what does the archaeology tell us was extremely enlightening and extremely interesting and provocative, but also had unexpected consequences in terms of the archaeology, which I can show you here. The site of the actual ambush is right in front of this mound here, so that it's here. This is one of the original steel railway sleepers, which was blown in 1917. And interestingly, in the background, I have a hilltop, but it's one of several redoubts, Turkish Ottoman redoubts. Now, Lawrence and the Bedouin attacked this train from this area here. So it's quite clear that these Ottoman redoubts were not there in 1917, or at least when the ambush took place, because it would have been suicide. They would have be able to kill the Bedouin with ease, who were down here, if they'd been up here, and indeed another one out of sight up here. So we could actually work out the transformation, the creation of a post-ambush conflict landscape. The ambush was so extraordinary that the Ottoman Turks clearly thought they had to reinforce and fortify this area against future attacks, which of course never came because the Arab Revolt moved on from this remote area, but leaving these two pristine Ottoman Turkish redoubts built after the event, shutting the door after the horse had bolted. So this, just being in this landscape, enabled us to interpret and suggest ideas and possibilities which had never been considered before, because as far as we were aware, there was hardly anything about the conflict landscape itself. It was all in the books and the literature, and in Lawrence's book, it was all about Lawrence and some of the Bedouin and how many Turks died, and it all took 10 minutes and so on and so forth. The actual on-the-ground archaeology of landscape, anthropology of landscape was totally missing, and we had this extraordinary opportunity to investigate this and this and this. The original possibility of being able to investigate well-preserved First World War Arab revolt remains, in fact, came from Bob Bewley's aerial photograph, this is it here, which is taken just to the west of Ma'an Station, and it shows this extraordinary crenellated trench line, north to south mainly, on the local Hill of the Birds, and you can see Ottoman soldiers in the trenches on the left-hand side. The remains of the preservation at the time Bob took this photograph, and to a certain extent still today, is incredible. It's possibly one of the best preserved and most visible line of Ottoman trenches from the Arab Revolt. And the fact that it's just a few kilometers outside of modern day Ma'an is extraordinary, really, although how much longer it will have this well-defined profile is another issue. But this attracted us in the first instance to the possibility that there might be some really interesting things here, although this was part of Ma'an Station, so it belonged to our original idea of looking at stations only. But as this image shows, it wasn't long before we were moving out into the landscape itself, and the whole project transformed. At the time that we investigated the Hill of the Birds, 2009, 10 and 11, we didn't quite know the significance, or we didn't know the significance of some of the fortifications that you can see here, the round redoubt and the original trench line beyond it. As we became more familiar with the area around Ma'an and further south along the Hejaz Railway line, these things became chronological markers and also cultural markers, because this is the kind of defense mechanism which was imported from Germany during the First World War. It wasn't something that was originally used. It was a kind of defense which came about after the fall of Aqaba, when the railway needed to be defended far more effectively. There were many ironies at the time of early years of looking and investigating Ma'an. One of them was this, a Jordanian army Humvee on the edge, sitting on the edge of an Ottoman trench at Ma'an. And this was a really interesting confluence of anthropology and archaeology. We were there doing the archaeology of conflict of the First World War and the Arab Revolt. At the time that we began, American and coalition forces were in Baghdad. And what we found was that depending on the news that was coming in to the Arab world about what was happening in Baghdad, local attitudes to us would shift. They'd either be not particularly interested, vaguely interested, and occasionally hostile. And that was a reflection, we think, of whatever the American and coalition forces were doing over the border in Iraq. And so we were doing conflict archaeology of 100 years before, but in a context and an atmosphere of a modern day version of conflict, just a relatively short distance away over the borders in Iraq. So that in itself was an extremely interesting and sometimes slightly worrying series of events. We tried to involve, and to a certain extent did, local community, local school children who we encouraged with their teachers to visit our work on the Hill of the Birds by Ma'an Station itself. And this just records one of those visits. It was interesting that there was a lot of curiosity, but not particularly any interest in getting in the trench and having a go or doing something which you might get in other parts of the world. I think maybe it was just too unusual and too strange to think, why were these people here doing this? And of course, one of the reasons was obviously that we were there looking for vast quantities of Turkish gold, of which I could spend half an hour telling you extraordinary stories. What we find in the archaeology of conflict is a light scatter of expended munitions at most of the sites that we looked at. Now, the key thing here, which I'll come back to, is that the archaeology of this project was basically horizontal stratigraphy. It wasn't vertical stratigraphy, it was horizontal. And that led to all kinds of interesting and challenging issues. Some of the things we found are Ottoman army buttons, star, crescent moon, star, Ottoman officers' seal, matrix, shell cases, glass, cigarette packets, cigarette papers, cutthroat razors, tobacco tin lids from Bristol of all places, and one of our favorites, a pair of what looks like exploded underpants. But this is the out in the desert, out in the Jebel Shera, south of Ma'an, an extraordinarily beautiful and challenging landscape for the builders of the Hejaz Railway and the defenders of the Hejaz Railway during the Arab Revolt. Here we can see one of the things which we discovered from the air, which looks to us like the remains of post holes which originally had barbed wire entanglements around. There are other explanations, but that's the one we think is our favorite. And what you can see here is the proximity of this small fortress to the original Hejaz Railway embankment, although that stretch of line is more modern for the phosphate trains I mentioned before. But it shows quite clearly those those lines of circular holes, which we can see and for which there is historical documentation that once Aqaba had fallen and these fortifications needed to be strengthened, that swathes of barbed wire were hastily erected around some of the more vulnerable and isolated Hejaz Railway locations or halts, places for quick stopping. We did the normal excavation and planning and survey, as you can imagine, and this gives you an example of that. Sometimes the chronology of these buildings gave us insights into the construction and the defense of the whole railway from 1900 right the way through to 1918. Our most challenging area in many respects was the Batan Al Ghul station area, which we called the Fasur Ridge sector. There are many construction camps here, recycled medieval defenses, and machine gun locations out in the desert, as the railway itself navigates down from the plateau in the north down to Wadi Rutum, the sandy wastes below. And this was Fasur Ridge Fort, which here you can see is here And this is what it looked like from the air, and this is what our survey plan map looked like as well. Almost certainly a late medieval location which had been recycled, reconfigured and reinforced during the Arab Revolt. Particularly interesting was this area in the middle of it, which seems to have been an officer's headquarters location with ceremonial paths leading from different buildings. Quite an astonishing discovery. And not that far away was an Ottoman mule trough, because there were never enough troops out in the desert to protect the railway, never enough Ottoman troops. And what they had to do was have small patrols on muleback, going from one place to another place to another place. And obviously they had to feed and water the mules. This is one of those mule troughs that we surveyed and excavated and found mule shoes, as you can see in the bottom right. So you can see that as we went through year by year, we were able to build up a far more nuanced, sophisticated, insightful understanding of what went on. It wasn't just a case of blow up some railway stations and run away. There's all kinds of other things going on here.
5 minutes, Nick.
The rest of the area that we were looking at went stretched down south to the Saudi border. And here we have a wonderful aerial view down Wadi Rutam. Wadi Rutam station, abandoned today. And Wadi Rutam army camp, which is different from a construction camp in the layout, the sophistication. Not many people lived here for not very long, unlike the construction camps. And here we have the example of horizontal stratigraphy, a prehistoric tool, Ottoman army buttons, spoon and a padlock. And very interesting indeed, the discovery of what was almost certainly an overnight stop for a Hajj caravan from several hundred years before, and still used today in the sort of the archaeology of yesterday in a Bedouin overnight camp. They stop in the same place. I'll miss that one. In the last couple of minutes, I'd just like to show you some of the more extraordinary discoveries, which we can discuss later. And here was looking at photographs with the local sheikh in terms of trying to find a really ephemeral site, a Royal Air Force landing ground, which you can see in the top. And we managed to discover it after several years of trying in the bottom here. Looks very different, but the geology gives the game away. Even more so was an overnight raiding location of an armoured car, Rolls Royce armoured car site. A photograph at the time, 1918, and as we rediscovered it in 2012, with diagnostic information, tins with a date, wonderful Rolls Royce armoured car bits and pieces. And at the end of the day, there's many more things to say, obviously, but I wanted to sort of bring the whole thing back into focus, because archaeology should never stop. We're always developing new ideas, new theories, looking at things in a different way, whether it's 100,000 years old, 100 years old, or perhaps not even that. And the archaeology of the cinema, if one wants, is the Aqaba film set at Almeria in southern Spain, which was constructed by David Lean for his epic Lawrence of Arabia. And this is what it looks like today. So we go back for the film, which was real. It was actually built. There is an archaeology there. The archaeology is still there, but it lies underneath. So when does archaeology stop? Never. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nick. Absolutely fascinating, and a great message to end on in terms of the fact that archaeology is continuous. Questions are coming in, but keep them coming. That's really great. And I can now introduce Dr. Bakar Al-Majali, who will talk for 10 minutes as a discussant and as a response to help stimulate further questions. So over to you now, Dr. Bakar. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Really, I read paragraphs in the book, The Desert Insurgency. It is a very great effort by Dr. Nicholas Sanders. Great thanks for him. And I still remember that I joined the team who came to Jordan, and I spent the night with them at Petra at Adom Hotel. And really it was maybe the first effort to study the land of Jordan in the point of view of the Great Arab Revolt and the rule of Lawrence at that time, and the local people. Here in this study, as I read and as I hear to Dr. Nicholas Sanders, maybe he concentrate only on the foreign books or foreign informations. And I feel that nothing about Arabic sources and about the local views of the people, how they see or how they did see in the past the operations, and about their memories from their fathers, grandfathers, and they still exist, these people, to talk about the real events at that time. This book explained all the facts of the land and about the really it will be a very great source by the maps and the drawers that in this book, because really we lack to have like these sources. At the same time, I don't know why in the book they called the Great Arab Revolt the guerrilla war. That's the revolt. It was by two kinds of armies, the regular army and the irregular army. Only most of the studies concentrated only on the irregular army only, but not about the regular army, which was consist of officers who was fought during the First World War and then be as prisoners by the British, and the British themselves helped the Arabs to let these officers come back to Hejaz and to join the Sharif Hussein bin Ali and really to build the Arabic army at that time, and they launch regular attacks and regular operations in Mudawwara and Ma'an and Aqaba and Tafila and all these places that the team visited at that time. Really, we need to rewrite some facts about the Great Arab Revolt to tell that this war it wasn't only as a guerrilla or gags or something else, but really it was as an allied forces fought with the British and the French at that time. So we need to have a kind of evaluation to the rule of the Great Arab Revolt that helped the British at that time, because as one of the British American study about this, I read it. It says that the British and the French could win the war during the First World War without the help by the Arabs. But the rule of the Arabs at that time was that the British win the war by little casualties and less efforts. So we want really to get a kind of concentrate on the Arab rule, why we are studying the land. Also, the part of the land is the people who lives on this land. And so to concentrate that there's a kind of friendship between the Arabs and the British, especially for us as Jordanians. So now, when we read like this study, really, we need also to add some facts to this effort, because the revolt itself, it was with the political sides, economical sides, religion sides, or religion dimensions, or something else. So we need like a kind of this information to be in like this effort. This effort, we feel that it is concentrate on the land, on the stations, on the railway, on the fortifications, and all of this. And really, this it was again a great effort. I still remember a study. It was in 1980 by a British and American officers who give this study as a master thesis or something else at Leavenworth College. I still remember the name of the man, but this captain, it was at that time, became as the leader of the American officers at Iraq in 1992. He is a Lebanese origin officer who really issued a study which is named the Military Evaluation of the Great Arab Revolt. And he tells some facts that I said. So again, when we really read this study, and sometimes I will mess about some stations. I know that no any kind of stations, Ottoman stations at Wadi Rum, but here the author mentioned that one stations at Wadi Rum, no stations. Now the station, it was built after 1976 at Wadi Rum, and before this time. And this is a station is built because to to send the phosphate from the phosphate mines by the railway to Aqaba from Shidiya and from north of Ma'an. So, and this is started from Batn al-Ghul, from Hattiya fortification there and Hattiya station. And really there are many fortifications between Ma'an and Mudawwara, and we know that the first tank battle on the land of Jordan took place at Mudawwara at that time. And Frederick Peak, who was the first commander of the Jordanian army, who is the first man, headed Bedouins with camels, reached to Al-Mudawwara and get a fight there with tanks, Rolls Royce tanks at that time. So again, really like this study, it's very useful, very grateful for us. It will be a main source to study the Great Arab Revolt, and it will be a very valuable addition to our library, and we need more by these like this studies. And at that time, when we get a little time with the team who came to Jordan, I still remember that the debate between us, it was about the real rule and about the 7 pillars of wisdom here in Jordan. And as for me, that I studied the 7 pillars of wisdom, that the percentage of the truth in it, no more than 40. No more than 40. Because there's an imagination stories that's not real at all. And Lawrence, he was in 2 or 3 places in the same time in it, with 500 kilometers between a place and another place. And really, the film, which was filmed in Jordan 1960, and my father was at the police at that time, cavalry police, and he participated in the film. And he told me that they give him $10, 5 for the horse and $5 dinars for him at that time. I still remember this. These really, in general, the film, it was an insult for the Arabs because it did not tell the facts. I said that 40%, the facts, but no, I am a liar. It's no more than 10%. We want to tell the truth, the history based on the truth first. And if you tell another stories, the people know the truth. But sometimes the media, and we can't reach the media, all the kind of medias, to tell the truth, to say what is going on. Anyway, really, again, this is a very great effort. Very thanks for Dr. Nicholas Sanders and the team from Bristol University at that time. We hope to see you again here in Jordan. This is your home. And thank you very much again. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bakr. And some of the questions that have come in relate exactly to what you're talking about. Nick, I don't know whether you want to respond to anything that Dr. Bakr said.
I'll keep it brief so we can go to the questions. But thank you, Dr. Bakr, very much indeed for that commentary. And it is true that we did spend a lot of time talking to local Bedouin people and local Arab people throughout the 9 years of actual field work. And they were often extremely helpful in our investigations. It was also the case that we found that more or less 50% of the local people we talked to were dismissive of Lawrence, that he was a fantasist, and it was really nothing to do with his genius at all. He was taking the credit from the regular army and from the Bedouin. The other 50% were completely different, and said that he was a great man. He mobilized, he energized, often with gold, and that basically they were proud because their great-grandfathers had rode camels with Lawrence. And so we had this very interesting anthropological, historical tension between people who said he was fake and people who said it was true, that he was a great man. So we tried not to obviously take sides. We were interested in this, exploring this tension. The other thing I'd just like to comment on is that most of the work that we did, if not almost all the work we did, was before the Faisal's army really gathered at Waheda, west of Ma'an. And so it wasn't the case that we didn't know that. We did know that. In fact, we were very lucky because we were able to investigate Waheda. We actually surveyed and excavated Waheda and talked to the local community there about their ancestral ideas and beliefs about Lawrence as a good person, Lawrence as a bad person. And one other last thing, which you mentioned, and I thought I have to clarify. I probably didn't clarify when I was talking, that Wadi Rum, as you say, never had a station, never had railway lines. And it was 1976, phosphate, etc. Exactly as you say. But not that far away was the railway station at Wadi Rutum, which is a completely different place. And we initially became a bit confused, but it soon became clear that what we were looking at was a chronology of the railway from the original railway to the 1976 phosphate railway. And the 1976 one is where you have the tourism attacks on the railway, etc., as you say. So I think that it's really, really valuable to get your input. But because it was 10 years worth of work, we couldn't mention everything. And so it's probably understandable that it's maybe we've made some mistakes and didn't make other things more clear. But we did try very much to get to the heart of the anthropological dimension, not just digging and surveying. So I think what you said is extremely true, extremely valuable, and we just hope we did something, as you indicated, that Jordan and other generations of historians can be proud of and can use in order to further our understanding of the Arab Revolt. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. And just while we're on the Lawrence theme, I don't know, Nick, whether you can see the questions, but the first one here is from Charles. I presume the surname is pronounced Harlech, but forgive me if I'm wrong. And the question is, would you consider T. Lawrence's 7 Pillars of Wisdom central to your archaeological investigations? Also, was there evidence that confirmed Lawrence's account in an interesting way? And I think we've covered some of that, but you might want to just close that question off.
I can't. Where can I see that?
If you click on Q&A, it's the first one in Q&A.
Right. Okay. Oh yeah. Okay. Hold on. Yeah. Well, this is an interesting question, and it does relate back also to Dr. Backer's commentary. There's many things written about Lawrence, about how reliable he is or is not, how much of a liar he was, or how brilliant he was at mobilizing the Bedouin, etc. What we found was, what we were doing was not investigating Lawrence. We were not driven by interest in Lawrence. We were interested in the landscape, the history of the railway, the way the Bedouin were drawn in and mobilized through gold and their own ideas and tactics. That was what interested us. The interesting thing here is that when it comes to describing the military activities when Lawrence was present, and of course he wasn't always present, but when he was, Seven Pillars seems to be extremely accurate in terms of the archaeology of what we found. It wasn't a completely different interpretation than Lawrence himself. Elsewhere, Lawrence may have exaggerated. Well, he admits he exaggerated his role. He admits that many times. But in terms of his interpretation of the historical conflict locations, we found that the archaeology supports that. And so that's like the first part of the question. So we found that what we were doing was a test, an archaeological test of what Lawrence had written as a history, as a memoir, as he himself says, a confabulation of many elements rather than a straightforward, historically true account.
Yeah.
I think many people don't always read that in Seven Pillars, that he was his own best or worst critic. The evidence confirmed TEL's account in an interesting way. The big example has to be the Tooth Hill site, which we discovered, the Rolls Royce armoured car overnight site, which was just Tutankhamun moment, I suppose you could say, because there is a quote which comes from Seven Pillars of Wisdom, where Lawrence is there at that site, drinking coffee, possibly rum, and observing the fire and the burning of the sticks and the crackling of the sticks in the night. And that was the campfire that we excavated. So sometimes it's an astonishing, truly astonishing bringing together of history, which could be literary, and archaeology, which is not literary. It's there and it has to be explained. So, you know, that's a long answer to a very short and precise double question, but I hope it answers some of you.
It is very important, and I like the way you say Tutankhamun moment, but actually a Richard III moment. Who would have thought you would have been able to find a, you know, English king under a car park in Leicester? You know, same as finding that in the desert. We'll move on to the next question. Veronique, were the bullet holes found and counted on the walls of Tel Sham station from the attack by Lawrence's party, or was the station also rebuilt in the 1960s?
Yeah, well, Veronique, I think almost all of the station buildings, the main station buildings, were rebuilt. They were rebuilt. A lot of the original materials were laying around where they've been blown up or ransacked subsequently, but sometimes local quarries were used to find new stone. But those local quarries were part of the original landscape for building the Hejaz Railway in the first place. So a lot of those quarries were used in 1900 and they were reused in the 1960s. And we've chronicled that, and we had no idea about that at the time. So that too is a really interesting aspect. But it does go back to the point I made near the beginning, that you have to be very careful what you think you're investigating, because it wasn't investigating what happened when Lawrence attacked, or when others attacked without Lawrence. It was in fact recycled and rebuilt in 1967, 68, 69.
And the next question sort of relates to that, which is a question from Riyad Ashmil asking, you know, are there any Ottoman sites that were kept away or are in a location that so there weren't any signs of deconstruction or refurbishment?
Yeah, there were ones that we found out in the desert when we began to realize that the conflict landscape was not just 100 meters either side of the railway. It actually went out into the desert. And the reason it went out into the desert is because the Ottomans did not know where the Bedouin and Lawrence would be attacking from. The Bedouin would be on horses and camels. They could come and go like lightning, and Lawrence would be in an armored car and he could do the same. And they came from all different directions. And so the Ottomans had to go out into the countryside and create fortifications. And those fortifications must have been known about for the last 100 years by the Bedouin, but they had no obvious significance or importance. And the Bedouin may not even actually known exactly what they were. They knew they were there, they were part of the traditional landscape, but that was it. So yes, the answer is yes to that.
Places that are untouched, that's good. And the next question from a PhD student, Tanya Newbury-Smith, her interest is warfare in the desert. And although she's got many questions, the first one is, how do you define, and this is obviously a quote, I don't remember you saying it, but first example of modern warfare, especially if you only excavated a limited area?
Yeah, no, our view is that this was the first example of modern guerrilla, what we would call modern guerrilla warfare, which was a synthesis of traditional Arab Bedou raiding with modern technology. So whether that's a machine gun or a bomb or a rifle or a Rolls Royce armored car or an aircraft biplane, the idea of adopting traditional Bedou raiding strategies, but with modern equipment, that makes it the first or one of the most important early examples of modern guerrilla warfare, not traditional guerrilla warfare.
Yeah, thank you. That's interesting. And then Ryder Kuba, can you expand a bit on Ottoman archives, their usefulness, accuracy, e.g. officers might have had incentive to exaggerate in reports, and accessibility from the Turkish government? Well,
it may well be that Dr. Bakker can shed more light on that than me. We found it absolutely impossible to access any Ottoman archives, either in Istanbul or
Ankara.
Or Ankara. I'm sure that if the situation was different, we might have been able to access some, but we found for 10 years we couldn't access any at all. That may have changed now. I don't know. It could have been our fault. I don't know. We were told that we would just not be given access to anything. We did manage to contact two Turkish academics in Istanbul who were extremely knowledgeable and actually could read the script, which was even more amazing to us. And they came down for one season to see what we were doing and did some translations in the Ottoman Marne cemetery. And then we never heard from them again. And it was clear that they were told, you know, not to be involved whatsoever. So who knows what went on there, but the Ottoman archives must have extraordinary resource of information. Absolutely amazing. We would have given anything to use it. We got nothing at all.
Thank you, Nick. Dr. Bakker, do you want to say anything? Yeah.
Yes, please. And first, I remember the name of the American officer. His name was John Abu Zaid. Then he became John Abu Zaid when he was the leader of the American army at Iraq, who wrote about the Great Arab Revolt. Something to talk about the archive. It's a very important thing. And I went several times to St. Anthony College at Oxford University. And I have the opportunity to read some of the Florence papers there. They are all of the Glabasha papers and Lawrence papers at that university at St. Anthony College. We got many of them, but about the Ottoman archive, we have some difficulties in reaching it because of the language. The archives written in the Arabic letters, but now in Turkey since 1925, there is the Latin letters now, and this is very now there are very few persons who can read the archives, and we have here researchers who went there and brought some of their archives, but not all the sources. They can't reach many of the sources that we need because there it was a kind of classifications for it. We have here sources, we have studies, and I have the opportunity to meet 5 persons who participated in the revolt. One of them, I met him at 1986. His name is Muhammad, the elder son of Adi Abu Taya, who entered Aqaba with Lawrence on the 6th of July 1917. And he told me, and I have a record for these and videos about all the events at Aqaba at that time. And he told me that we didn't see Lawrence. He told me that Lawrence, we saw him at the second day, and he spent about 2 days, and then he went to Egypt with 2 guides. This is, and he told me, and he was about 17 years old at that time, who was fighting with his father, Sheikh Ode Abu Tay. Really, we have many difficulties in reaching the archives. And since the past period, we haven't research who concentrate on the archive. We have papers, we have some books like George Antonius' book, Qadri Qal'aji book about these books. We have what wrote about Lawrence. We have many studies, especially British studies, about the life of Lawrence. And really, we have a historian, his name is Sulaiman Musa, who wrote many things, many books about the Great Revolt and Lawrence, and his effort was translated into Japanese language. And he went for about 3 months to London and get many of the documents about the history of Jordan, the rule of the British in Jordan during the Mandate period, and also during the Great Revolt. So thanks you again, and we hope that there will be a kind of cooperation to reach for more documents. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bakker. Ominous sign that Carol has entered the fray. We've got 2 minutes left. I don't know whether we can expand a bit, but there's a couple of questions haven't been answered. One very quickly, which I think you covered in a way, Warren Smith. Did you come across any hostilities while you were working, and was there any local assistance from interested locals, and any local stories which may have helped you in your work?
We didn't come across any inherent hostility at all. The only hostility we did come across was, as I mentioned, at Man in the early years, when there were things going on in Baghdad with the Americans and coalition. And then there could be people coming up and saying things to us about that, which is quite understandable, particularly in Ma'an, which is a very traditional part of Jordan. So that was the only problems we really had. And once that had kind of cleared the air, we didn't have, I don't think we had any hostility whatsoever. A lot of help we did get from local sheikhs and local Arabs passing through, passing by. And on several occasions, we were taken to places by local Bedouin. Did we know this? Would we like to see that? They didn't want money. They didn't want anything. There was no aspect like that to it. They just wanted to show us, because they could see how interested we were. Yeah. So not so much local stories, but local knowledge, yeah, where they would help us. So yes.
And I would like to finish on the question about virtual reality and technology. But before I do, Graham Barker has posted a thing which is more of a comment, that the British Institute in Ankara yesterday and the Society of Libyan Studies hosted a lecture by Professor Faulkner on the 1911 Ottoman-Italian War in Libya, and it was commented that this was an early example of modern guerrilla warfare by the Italians that Ottoman officers failed to learn from, with disastrous results for their armies in World War I. And that may help Tanya Newbury-Smith, and I'd suggest maybe if Tanya and Nick can link up outside the meeting, that would be really useful. But the question I wanted to get to was, how do you see the role of new technologies, if Carol will allow us time, such as virtual reality and augmented reality, in remodeling and revisualizing that history and telling the story as it should be, question mark? Well, there's a question. How should it be told? And what are the challenges to do that? So there you are, Nick, in 1 minute.
Yep. 2 questions, really. One is that I think the potential for retelling, reinterpreting, remodeling, revisualizing what we did and more is tremendous. We found that there was virtually no television interest in what we were doing when we were doing the project at all, 0, which was amazing to us. The other thing is that the nature of the project and the timing of it meant that we had virtually no new technologies. We didn't have, I don't think there were, drones or reliable LiDAR. We had to make do with aerial photographs from private archives, the Imperial War Museum.
Fantastic results.
And your very, very useful, indicative and path-breaking work, Bob. So, but apart from that, we didn't have access to the technology. We were not funded to that extent. And I'm not even sure now, if we went back, we would be allowed to use drone technology in that area near to the Saudi border, for example. But the potential for reimagining a more accurate, perhaps, view and version of what went on in 1916, 17 and 18, I think is extraordinary. And it amazes Neil Faulkner, my co-director, and myself for all these years, that there's been 0 interest at all.
Mm-hmm. And there are questions by Sean Mackay, Tanya again, and Veronique, but maybe we can deal with those outside and email the answers to those specific questions. So Carol, should I hand over to you for the final words, as we are already 3 minutes over?
Thank you very much, Bob. And many, many thanks to our speaker, Professor Nick Saunders today, for a fascinating insight and overview of the study, 10 years of study and much research that went into the book that we encourage everybody to have a look at. I've been reading sections of the book and looking at, as I've been looking at the slides and hearing the commentary, and that's an excellent sort of access into the archaeology of conflict, and a particularly important conflict for the foundation of Jordan. And also I'd like to thank Dr. Bakr al-Majali for being with us today and for his very valuable insights today at this event and comments, and also for previous events that you've attended with us, where you've really given us the Jordanian viewpoint and allowed us to sort of engage in the sort of professional side and how Jordan sort of views this particularly pivotal moment in its history, bearing in mind that this year, 2021, is the centenary of Jordan too. So thank you very much, Dr. Bakr, and thank you, Bob, for your expert chairing and guiding us through the questions. And also I'd like to give a thanks to Maggie, who's in the background, who's been helping us all today and giving some notices, as you can see, to everybody in the chat. And thank you to you for joining us today. We really hope that you enjoyed the event. And please keep an eye out for future CBRL events. And if you're not already on our mailing list, please do join our mailing list and consider becoming a member in future. You can find also all of our previous webinars on our YouTube site, CBRL Video, and also podcasts on our SoundCloud site too, CBRL Sound. We're currently planning events for 2022, so keep in touch, and thank you very much to everyone who's participated today and attended today. It's been a pleasure having you all with us and hearing the very fascinating conversation. And thank you once again to Professor Nicholas Saunders for this talk.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.